The first official warning from humanity reached the wider galaxy as a routine diplomatic transmission, dry in tone and stripped of emotion, delivered by a mid-level human envoy named Daniel Harper, who had spent 2 decades studying alien political behavior and had learned that most non-human powers trusted data more than voices. And the message stated clearly that continued expansion of the Krell Dominion toward the Orion Spur would result in consequences that the Dominion would be unable to contain. And when this warning was presented before the Galactic Council, it was met with low clicks of amusement, faint color shifts of mockery among the reptilian Ledhari delegates, and open dismissal from the Crystalline Voss Collective, who recorded the message as a psychological bluff, because at that time humanity was still categorized as a developing military culture, dangerous in theory but inefficient in practice, fragmented by internal politics, and lacking the unified will required for sustained interstellar conflict. And this assessment was shared by the Krell Dominion, whose war fleets had crushed 3 minor species in the last century alone. So when the Dominion continued its advance and established forward bases near human trade corridors, the Council did nothing. And when a second warning arrived, this time outlining precise coordinates and timelines that would be considered violations, the Council again ignored it, assuming humans would adapt as all lesser species. Eventually did. But within weeks of the final ignored transmission, the first Krell patrol fleet failed to report in after crossing into a sparsely charted region near the Perseus Drift, and initially this absence was attributed to navigation failure or subspace interference, common in that region. Yet when a second fleet vanished along a similar vector, concern began to ripple quietly through Krell Command, though publicly they dismissed it as coincidence, and the Council accepted that. Explanation: because no debris fields were detected, no emergency signals were recorded, and no known species claimed responsibility, and humans remained silent, which only reinforced the belief that they were uninvolved until a human long-range survey vessel named the Horizon Trace was observed calmly charting gas clouds less than a light year from the disappearance zone, and even then the Council assumed coincidence, because humans had always been explorers first and warriors second. But inside human space, the mood was different, as Admiral Karen Holt reviewed layer projections showing enemy fleet patterns overlaid with human sensor shadows, and she spoke quietly to a room of officers whose faces showed no triumph, only focus, reminding them that Phase 1 had achieved acceptable results and that escalation would continue only if the Dominion failed to disengage. And on a distant human outpost world, scientists led by Victor Lang finalized energy dispersion readings, confirming that the vanished fleets had not been destroyed in conventional terms but removed from normal space-time through controlled collapse fields, technology humanity had never shared and had deliberately concealed even from allies because it required patience and restraint rather than brute force, and restraint was something the galaxy did not associate with humans. Meanwhile, the Krell Dominion dispatched a full battle group to investigate the disappearances, led by War Marshal Threx, whose reputation was built on decisive annihilation, and his fleet advanced with shields fully charged and weapons primed, confident that whatever anomaly existed would be crushed through superior firepower. But as his ships crossed the invisible boundary that humans had defined weeks earlier, their senses began to lag by microseconds, then milliseconds, subtle enough to escape notice at first, until formation coherence degraded, and command relays experienced fractional delays. And by the time Threx realized something was wrong, the space around his flagship folded inward like a closing fist, not violently but smoothly, silencing engines, freezing reactors, and cutting the fleet from every known dimension of escape. And to the wider galaxy it appeared as if the battle group had simply ceased to exist, which finally forced the Council into emergency session, where delegates argued over theories ranging from ancient weapons to natural phenomena, and still no one spoke the word humanity, because accepting that conclusion would mean admitting a fundamental failure of judgment. But as debates dragged on, more fleets vanished along predictable routes, always those advancing toward human-claimed space, always without debris or survivors, and only then did analysts begin to notice that human merchant traffic had rerouted months earlier, that human colonies near the frontier had been quietly evacuated without panic, and that human military communications had shifted into closed-loop protocols long before the first disappearance. And Ambassador Lane Brooks, who had been silent through every session, finally addressed the Council with calm certainty, stating that humanity had warned them that the disappearances were not acts of aggression, but acts of containment, and that humans would prefer the galaxy remember this moment as a lesson rather than the beginning. And as her words echoed to the chamber, reports arrived that even deep core fleets were now hesitant to move, because no one could be sure where the boundaries lay anymore. And for the first time in recorded history, the galaxy felt something new, not fear of conquest, but fear of absence, the realization that fleets could vanish without battle, without spectacle, and without explanation, and that the species responsible had tried to prevent it through words alone before resorting to action. The emergency session ended without resolution, but the damage was already done, because uncertainty spread faster than any fleet ever could, and across dozens of star nations, admirals began revising patrol routes while merchants delayed departures and border governors demanded answers their governments could not provide. And inside, the Krell Dominion panic was carefully hidden behind ritual declarations of strength, as internal reports confirmed that nearly a third of their active expeditionary forces were simply gone, not destroyed, not captured, but erased from every operational ledger, and War Marshal Threx's name was quietly removed from ceremonial records as if he had never existed. Yet the Dominion's ruling Senate refused to acknowledge weakness, and instead authorized Operation Burning Path, a mass mobilization meant to overwhelm whatever force dared interfere, convinced that no species could remove so much power without revealing itself eventually. And as this order rippled outward, humanity observed without celebration, because within the quiet halls of Earth's Unified Defense Command the atmosphere was heavy with calculation rather than pride, and Admiral Karen Holt addressed her counterparts from Mars, Luna, and the outer colonies with measured restraint, stating that Phase 2 would proceed only if the Dominion crossed the third threshold, and that until then all actions would remain deniable, reversible, and limited, because the objective was not victory but comprehension, to teach the galaxy to understand boundaries rather than test them. And this philosophy baffled younger officers like Captain Aaron Cole, who had trained his entire career for decisive engagement and struggled to accept a strategy built on disappearance instead of confrontation. But Holt reminded him that humans had learned long ago that the most effective deterrence was not visible strength but unpredictable consequence. Meanwhile, on the alien side, the Galactic Council commissioned an independent investigation led by the neutral Athari Concord, a species known for meticulous historical records rather than military power, and their analysts began reconstructing timelines with brutal precision, cross-referencing trade logs, sensor anomalies, and human diplomatic traffic. And the pattern that emerged was deeply unsettling, because every vanished fleet had crossed a line that humans had explicitly marked in advance, sometimes weeks earlier, sometimes months, and never once had a fleet disappeared outside those parameters, which meant this was not chaos or accident but enforcement. And when the Athari presented these findings, several council delegates attempted to suppress the report, fearing political fallout. But suppression failed when fragments leaked to public networks, igniting speculation across inhabited space. And in quiet human research facilities, scientists like Victor Lang monitored the growing panic with mixed emotions, knowing that the collapsed field technology they had perfected was elegant but terrifying, capable of isolating entire armadas into pocket realities where time barely moved and energy could not escape, effectively placing enemy forces into indefinite suspension without a single casualty, a solution born from human reluctance to annihilate rather than inability to do so. And this nuance was completely lost on alien observers who measured power solely by destruction, and as Operation Burning Path moved forward, massive Krell fleets gathered near rally points, their commanders convinced that sheer numbers would reveal the enemy's hand. But what they did not realize was that humanity had anticipated this response decades earlier, designing layered thresholds not as lines in space, but as adaptive volumes that shifted based on mass, velocity, and intent, meaning the more aggressively the Dominion mobilized, the narrower their margin for error became, and deep within a command bunker beneath the Nevada desert, Ambassador Elaine Brooks coordinated with military and civilian leadership, preparing the message that would follow the next escalation, not a threat, but an explanation, because humans still believed the galaxy could learn. Yet, as report confirmed, that the Dominion's mass fleets were accelerating toward human space despite every warning. Brooks understood that comprehension often came only after loss, and far beyond council chambers and human bunkers, among independent traders and minor species, a new narrative was forming, whispered in docking bays and encrypted channels, that humanity did not conquer, did not boast, and did not chase glory, but instead removed problems so quietly that the absence itself became the warning. And as the first burning path fleets crossed into what they believed was uncontested space, the galaxy held its breath, unaware that it was about to learn that humans did not fight wars the way anyone expected, and that what came next would permanently redefine what power meant among the stars. As the burning path fleets advanced, their commanders transmitted ritual proclamations of dominance across open channels. Declarations meant as much for internal morale as for external intimidation, yet the silence that answered them was total, because humanity did not respond to bravado, and within the adaptive volumes that defined the human thresholds, sensors belonging to the Dominion began to register contradictions that could not be reconciled by their tactical doctrines, stars appearing fractionally displaced, gravity wells reporting inconsistent mass readings, and time-stamped communications arriving in the wrong order, all subtle enough to be dismissed individually, but devastating when combined. And aboard the command carrier of Fleet Lord Zareth, confidence eroded into irritation as technicians reported anomalies that refused to resolve. And when Zareth demanded confirmation of enemy contact, the answer remained unchanged. There was none, only space behaving incorrectly. And this deeply unsettled Krelf doctrine, which equated threat with visibility. Meanwhile, across human space, the movement of fleets was almost invisible, because humanity had long abandoned the idea of massing ships in obvious formations, instead dispersing assets into modular task clusters that could converge or dissolve without notice. And Admiral Karen Holt watched as predictive models updated in real time, each Krelf acceleration narrowing their operational freedom, not because of any single weapon, but because the space around them was being reshaped in response to their choices. And this was the core of the human strategy, not forcing the enemy into battle, but allowing them to choose escalation until escalation itself became impossible. And on Earth, the public remained largely unaware of the scale of events, because human leadership had learned through bitter experience that panic was more dangerous than ignorance. So daily life continued under a calm sky, while far beyond, entire alien armadas drifted unknowingly toward containment, and within the Galactic Council the political situation deteriorated rapidly, as representatives from smaller powers demanded emergency guarantees, asking whether the same fate could befall them without warning, and Ambassador Lane Brooks answered each inquiry with the same measured statement, that humanity had never acted without notice, that warnings had been issued clearly and repeatedly, and that respect for boundaries was the only requirement for safety. Yet this answer unsettled rather than reassured, because it implied that survival now depended on interpreting human intent correctly, and no species believed it truly understood humans. Meanwhile, the Athari Concord continued its investigation and uncovered a final disturbing correlation, that every vanished fleet had shown aggressive posture metrics exceeding a specific threshold, meaning that mere presence was not enough to trigger containment, only intent. Concept alien militaries had never encoded into their systems, because intent was considered irrelevant next to firepower, and when this finding reached Krelf intelligence too late, the Burning Path Vanguard crossed the final threshold, and the transition was so smooth that many crews did not realize anything had happened at all. Engines humming, reactors stable, stars ahead fixed in place, until long-range comms failed and backup systems echoed the same silence, and slowly the truth settled in that they were no longer moving through space but contained within it, folded into a region where exit vectors no longer existed, and Fleet Lord Zareth attempted to order a coordinated withdrawal, only to discover that coordination itself required causality that was no longer guaranteed, commands arriving before they were sent, acknowledgments never forming, and panic spread through ranks trained only for direct conflict, while in a control facility light years away, Victor Lang confirmed containment stability across thousands of simultaneous nodes, noting with quiet gravity that no lives had been lost and that suspension conditions remained humane, though he also acknowledged that from the perspective of those contained, time would stretch endlessly, a mercy and a punishment intertwined. And as the news of the Burning Path Vanguard's disappearance reached the galaxy, shock finally shattered denial, because this was no longer a probing patrol or a limited engagement, but the core of a great power's military might, gone without battle, and Council worlds began issuing unilateral disengagement orders. Borders were redrawn overnight, and alliances strained under the sudden realization that force alone no longer guaranteed relevance. And in a final emergency address to the Council, Elaine Brooks spoke plainly, stating that humanity had no desire to rule, no interest in tribute, and no patience for conquest, but that it would enforce the right to exist without encroachment, and that the fleets suspended beyond space were proof not of human aggression, but of human restraint, because annihilation would have been easier, faster, and more acceptable by galactic standards. And as her words spread beyond the chamber into public consciousness, the galaxy began to understand that it had misjudged not human strength, but human philosophy, and that the fleets vanishing into silence were not the beginning of a war, but the consequence of ignoring a warning delivered calmly, clearly, and without threat. The realization that intent itself could trigger containment sent shockwaves through every military doctrine in the known galaxy, because for the first time power was being judged not by what fleets could do, but by why they were moving at all, and this forced a level of self-examination that most civilizations had never practiced, as within the Krell Dominion the Synod fractured into bitter factions, some demanding total retreat and negotiation, others insisting that submission to human. Defined intent metrics would be the end of Krell sovereignty, and this internal conflict paralyzed their response far more effectively than any external threat, while in human command circles the debate was equally intense but far quieter. As Admiral Karen Holt faced pressure from industrial blocs and frontier governors who argued that the galaxy now feared humanity and that fear could be leveraged into permanent security guarantees, yet Holt countered that fear was unstable and that misunderstanding had caused this crisis in the first place, reminding them that humans had built the thresholds not to dominate but to teach restraint at scale, and that turning containment into coercion would only validate the worst alien assumptions about human nature. Meanwhile, Victor Lang and his research teams began facing ethical inquiries from within their own society. Philosophers and civilian oversight boards questioning whether indefinite suspension without consent was truly humane, even if no physical harm occurred, and Lang answered honestly that it was the least violent option available, that every alternative involved mass casualties measured in billions, and that humans had chosen a burden they would carry themselves rather than pass on to the galaxy. And as these debates unfolded, the smaller species of the galaxy acted with pragmatic speed, withdrawing patrols, rerouting trade lanes, and in some cases dismantling forward weapons platforms near human space entirely. Because while they did not fully understand the thresholds, they understood enough to know that ignorance was no longer an excuse, and among these species a quiet respect for humanity began to grow, not admiration, but recognition of a power that did not need spectacle to be effective. Yet the Krell hardliners were not finished, and in a final act of defiance, they authorized a covert strike using autonomous weapon swarms designed to mask intent signatures, believing they'd found a loophole. And this decision was made without informing the wider council, because desperation had narrowed their vision, and when the swarm launched from hidden carriers and accelerated toward a human agricultural system, humanity detected it instantly, not through intent metrics, but through pattern deviation, because the threshold were only one layer of a much deeper defensive philosophy, and Admiral Holt authorized a response that would remove all ambiguity, as containment fields blossomed not only around the swarm but around the carriers themselves, revealing their positions in a single, undeniable moment. And this time humanity did not remain silent, as Ambassador Lane Brooks addressed the galaxy with controlled disappointment, stating that deception had been attempted, that the response had been proportional, and that further attempts to bypass understanding would result in permanent isolation rather than temporary suspension, and the weight of that word permanent echoed far more heavily than any threat of destruction, because isolation in a connected galaxy meant cultural and economic extinction, and as the Krell Dominion absorbed this final lesson, their resistance collapsed, the Synod voting to withdraw all forces from contested regions and formally acknowledge human-defined boundaries, an act that would have been unthinkable months earlier, and as fleets halted, borders stabilized, and trade slowly resumed, the galaxy entered a new era not marked by treaties or wars, but by absence of conflict enforced by comprehension, and humanity, having demonstrated its capability, began the long work of explaining itself, opening channels, sharing limited theory, and emphasizing that the threshold were not traps but agreements written into space itself, and while suspicion would linger for generations, the memory of entire fleets vanishing without a shot fired ensured that warnings would never again be ignored so casually, and that when humans spoke calmly, the galaxy would listen. In the months that followed the Krell withdrawal, the galaxy did not return to normal, because normal had depended on the assumption that power was loud, visible, and negotiated only after violence. And that assumption was now broken beyond repair, as navies across known space rewrote engagement protocols to include concepts they barely understood: intent modulation, posture dampening, and compliance signaling, all attempts to avoid triggering human thresholds they could not see. And this uncertainty reshaped politics as much as strategy, because worlds that had once relied on protection of dominant empires now questioned whether those empires could truly shield them, while humanity, without demanding tribute or allegiance, became an unavoidable reference point in every serious discussion of security. And within Earth's Unified Defense Command, Admiral Karen Holt oversaw the gradual deactivation of several containment volumes, not as a gesture of weakness, but as proof that enforcement was conditional, reversible, and tied directly to behavior, a decision that unsettled some allies who had grown comfortable under the shadow of human capability. Yet Holt insisted that stability required trust built through consistency rather than perpetual threat. And this philosophy guided Ambassador Lane Brooks as she began a careful tour of neutral and former adversary worlds, not to boast but to explain, delivering the same core message repeatedly: that humanity did not seek to redefine the galaxy in its own image, only to survive within it without being forced into endless war. And while many delegates listened politely without full comprehension, the absence of vanished fleets in regions that respected boundaries spoke louder than any speech. Meanwhile, Victor Lang found himself at the center of a growing scientific exchange, as alien researchers cautiously requested insight into the theoretical principles behind containment, not the technology itself, but the reasoning. And Lang shared what he could, explaining that humans had learned to see conflict as a system rather than an event, something shaped long before the first shot and decided by choices rather than outcomes. And this perspective fascinated some species while terrifying others, because it implied accountability at a level they had never faced. And yet not all consequences were external, because within humanity dissent continued to grow quietly, veterans of past wars questioning whether making war invisible risked making it too easy, too abstract. And Holt addressed these concerns directly in closed forums, acknowledging that the burden of such power was heavy precisely because it removed the catharsis of victory, replacing it with endless vigilance. And she reminded them that the alternative had been annihilation on a scale that history could not forgive. And as these internal debates continued, intelligence reports confirmed that several former aggressor states were fragmenting under the pressure of reform, their military elites stripped of purpose, their populations grappling with a new reality where intimidation no longer worked, and nowhere was this more evident than within the Krell Dominion, now diminished, cautious, and inward focused, their once proud fleets idle, crews reassigned to civil infrastructure and exploration, a humiliation that slowly transformed into reluctant adaptation. And in a quiet but significant moment, a Krell delegation requested observer status within a human-led conflict-to-escalation symposium, an act that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. And as the galaxy watched this shift unfold, traders returned to lanes once feared, colonies resumed expansion under clearer rules, and children on distant worlds grew up in a galaxy where fleets no longer vanished mysteriously, because a lesson had been learned, not through destruction but through absence, and humanity, having forced that lesson upon the stars, now faced the harder task of living with what it had taught, knowing that every future warning would carry the weight of what happened when the galaxy chose not to listen. Even as the galaxy began tentative recovery, subtle tremors persisted in political and military systems, because no species could unlearn the memory of fleets disappearing without warning, and every planning table now incorporated hypothetical thresholds of intent into calculations that had previously relied only on firepower and logistics and on human worlds. Admiral Karen Holt convened strategy councils not to plan offensives, but to review compliance patterns and project how lingering misunderstandings might escalate, noting that deterrence worked only as long as it was perceived as consistent, predictable, and fair, a concept foreign to species whose doctrines emphasized overwhelming retaliation. And while some allies questioned why humans did not capitalize on the fear they had created, Holt repeatedly stressed that survival and ethical stewardship were not synonymous with exploitation. And this disciplined approach was mirrored by Ambassador Elaine Brooks as she addressed increasingly complex diplomatic challenges, explaining that containment was not a weapon but a statement of principle, and that ignoring those principles had caused fleets to vanish, Yet she emphasized that humanity remained committed to communication, warning, and negotiation as first steps in any conflict scenario, and while some delegates from smaller systems still struggled to trust his assertion, the evidence was undeniable, because every region that respected human-defined intent zones remained untouched. Every fleet that crossed those invisible lines faced the same silent suspension, and even as the Krell Dominion slowly rebuilt, it did so under strict internal oversight, with each maneuver scrutinized to avoid even the appearance of aggression, while behind the scenes human engineers and scientists continued refining collapsed field technology, not to expand it for conquest, but to ensure the system remained precise, stable, and humane, able to respond to threats without physical destruction. And as reports arrived of smaller skirmishes near fringe systems being contained without a single casualty, a quiet admiration began to form among neutral species. Not a warm friendship, but recognition that human strategy combined intellect, restraint, and decisive action in ways no other civilization had mastered. And across the galaxy, speculative literature, simulations, and debate began proliferating, with scholars dissecting human philosophy of conflict, military, academies rewriting doctrine, and independent thinkers suggesting that perhaps the key to stability was not endless escalation, but a clear, enforceable framework of mutual comprehension. And within Earth's Unified Defense Command, Karen Holt oversaw the careful calibration of containment parameters, noting subtle adjustments to account for evolving alien behavior, while Victor Lang continued research into theoretical underpinnings of human spatial manipulation, his work increasingly shared in joint interstellar conferences under strict ethical oversight, emphasizing restraint over application. And as decades passed, generations of alien leaders grew up with the memory of vanished fleets as a cautionary tale, a story repeated to military cadets, diplomats, and politicians as evidence that misunderstanding human intent was no longer survivable, and humanity, though never seeking glory or dominion, became an unspoken axis of stability, a species whose silence was respected as much as its voice, whose thresholds enforce a new order without war. And as Ambassador Brooks addressed the final session of a Galaxy Reconciliation Summit, she reminded delegates that humanity's actions had not been punitive, that fleets had vanished because warnings were ignored, and that the lesson was simple yet profound. Comprehension was a cost of survival, vigilance the measure of peace, and for the first time, the galaxy understood that power could be exercised without violence, that the absence of action could speak louder than fleets, and that humans, having demonstrated the consequences of neglect, had forever altered the calculus of interstellar relations. As decades unfolded, the galaxy adjusted to the new paradigm, not with fanfare but through gradual, systemic transformation, because every civilization had internalized that human warnings were not empty rhetoric, and that crossing invisible thresholds could lead to consequences no fleet could counter. And this reality reshaped exploration, trade, diplomacy, and war planning simultaneously, with alien strategists developing layered protocols for interpreting human signals, filtering intent through multiple levels of analysis, and embedding behavioral compliance into automated systems. And in human space, Admiral Karen Holt continued to supervise the integration of predictive algorithms that could anticipate alien movement before it became actionable, not to dominate but to maintain stability, while Ambassador Lane Brooks coordinated interstellar educational programs, explaining the philosophy behind containment, the ethics of restraint, and the power of measured enforcement. And these programs, though initially met with skepticism, gradually gained traction, particularly among younger leaders who had no memory of fleets vanishing and who were eager to prevent repetition of past mistakes. And Victor Lang's theoretical work matured into a formalized discipline of spatial ethics, teaching civilizations how to assess potential threats and intentions in multidimensional frameworks, not for offense but for comprehension, a field that spread across academic institutions, in multiple systems, and in parallel, human engineers refined containment technology to a level of near invisibility, ensuring that enforcement remained subtle, precise, and ethically constrained, capable of isolating forces without harm while allowing freedom for compliant actors. And across the former Krell Dominion, political culture shifted toward transparency, accountability, and cautious engagement, as leaders who had once relied on intimidation learned that reputation alone could no longer secure influence, while military doctrines emphasized adaptability, observation, and avoidance of thresholds rather than aggression. And even among neutral species, The presence of human principles in policy discussions created a shared vocabulary for risk, intent, and restraint, with independent councils, trade federations, and alliance networks adopting compliance codes inspired directly by human practice. And despite the passage of time, memory of the vanished fleets remained a potent psychological force, invoked in strategy briefings, diplomatic negotiations, and even entertainment media, as cautionary tales warning that the galaxy had underestimated humanity at its peril, and within human society itself. The responsibility of wielding such influence fostered an ethic of vigilance, debate, and humility, ensuring that the same lessons would not be abused or misinterpreted. And when new threats arose on the distant frontiers, humans addressed them not with immediate escalation but through calibrated communication, phased containment, and carefully measured deterrence, demonstrating that power without arrogance, enforcement without destruction, and silence without cowardice could reshape conflict in profound ways. And as Ambassador Brooks addressed a galactic assembly for what would become her final session before retirement, she framed the century of change succinctly. Humanity had not sought to dominate. Fleets had not been destroyed, and yet the galaxy had learned a lesson written not in blood but in absence, and that lesson would define interstellar conduct for generations, proving that intelligence, patience, and ethical clarity could enforce peace more effectively than any fleet of warships. By the time the 8th decade of the human threshold era arrived, the galaxy had irrevocably transformed, because every species had internalized the lessons taught not through battles won or planets conquered, but through absence in force or precision. And the memory of vanished fleets remained a cornerstone of interstellar caution, shaping strategy, diplomacy, trade, and even culture, and within human civilization. The responsibility of wielding such influence had become institutionalized, with councils overseeing threshold management, ethical review boards ensuring restraint, and educational programs instilling the philosophy that deterrence was only effective when exercised transparently, predictably, and morally. And Admiral Karen Holt, now elder but still influential, reviewed centuries of data showing that no fleet had been lost to human action that had not first been warned, that no civilization had suffered physical harm, and yet compliance had been absolute wherever. Humans had clearly communicated boundaries, and this record became a global teaching point, a living archive of restraint as a tool of survival. While Ambassador Lane Brooks had retired from active diplomacy, but remained a revered figure, invited to lecture across multiple systems on the art of communication, the ethics of intent enforcement, and the consequences of underestimating an intelligent, patient species. And Victor Lang's work had matured into an interstellar discipline, spatial ethics, guiding alien academies and human institutions alike on how to assess intentions, anticipate outcomes, and integrate multidimensional logic into decision-making. And the former corrupt Dominion, now cautiously cooperative, had restructured society around transparency, predictive planning, and interspecies consultation. Their fleets smaller but more disciplined, their generals tempered by the knowledge that misjudgment could result in suspension rather than destruction. And across neutral and allied worlds, humans were no longer feared for aggression, but respected for their capacity to enforce peace with minimal force. As trade networks stabilized, colonies expanded under clear rules, and alliances were forged with understanding rather than intimidation. And throughout all this, the story of vanished fleets became legend, recorded in chronicles, simulations, and histories as the moment the galaxy learned to listen, to comprehend, and to act with foresight. And when humans finally addressed the assembled council for a final review of threshold operations, they reiterated the core philosophy, that absence had spoken louder than fleets, that restraint could teach more than violence, and that intelligence, patience, and ethical clarity were the most formidable forces in the cosmos. And as their words resonated across listening systems, it was clear that the galaxy had absorbed the lesson completely, not through conquest but through understanding, and that humanity, though never seeking dominion, had forever altered the nature of power, proving that the species capable of patience, precision, and principle could redefine an entire interstellar order without firing a single shot, leaving a legacy of compliance, caution, and comprehension that would endure for generations.